The world feels like it's running on rather questionable leadership. Trump is dominating the headlines again. Russia keeps reminding everyone it never found the off button. And Maduro was just flown to the United States after a very unpleasant visit from American Special Forces, which proves one thing: humanity has a remarkable talent for making spectacularly bad decisions. And Ford turned that talent into engineering. Because alongside some of the greatest cars ever built, Ford also created machines so misguided, so painfully wrong, they make global politics look almost well-planned. Today, on the 10 worst cars from Ford, automotive disasters, we're counting down the worst Fords ever made. The disasters, the scandals, and the mechanical nightmares. And the number one car was so bad. If it were a government decision, Congress would still be holding hearings about it. So, let's begin. Number 10. The Ford Mustang II. The Mustang II is proof that even a legend can end up like the first Trump-Biden debate in 2020. Lots of noise, plenty of familiar names, and absolutely no one remembers the point. It was born in the middle of the oil crisis and a general fear of everything, so Ford took an icon of freedom and turned it into something like a bipartisan compromise. The engines were weaker than promises of tax cuts, and the character disappeared faster than political unity in Congress. It wasn't a bad car, it was cautious, smoothed over, and completely lacking courage. The Mustang II feels like an America that desperately tries not to offend anyone and somehow manages to annoy everyone instead. Because when you take a muscle car, remove the muscle, and replace it with good intentions, you don't get progress. You get the Mustang II. At number 9, we have the Ford Fairmont, a car so painfully average it makes beige wallpaper look exciting. Ford introduced it as the future, lighter, more efficient, and built on the brand new Fox platform. And technically speaking, it worked. It was reliable, practical, and perfectly adequate. The problem was that it had the personality of a waiting room chair. No excitement, no bold design, no reason to turn your head in a parking lot. The Fairmont wasn't a disaster, a scandal, or even a particularly bad car. It was something much worse. It was invisible, completely forgettable. Like Gerald Ford, except at least that Ford accidentally became president. This Ford accidentally became a car. At number 8, we have the Ford Pinto, a car that became famous for all the wrong reasons. In the early 1970s, America wanted small, cheap cars, and Ford rushed to deliver one. The Pinto was affordable, simple, and it actually sold extremely well, but there was just one tiny problem. In certain rear-end collisions, the fuel tank had an unfortunate habit of turning the car into something resembling a backyard barbecue. What followed was lawsuits, investigations, and one of the biggest public relations disasters in automotive history. The Pinto wasn't just a bad car. It became a symbol of what happens when cost-cutting beats common sense. At number 7, we have the Ford Contour and its slightly more mysterious twin, the Mercury Mystique. Ford thought this was a brilliant idea. Take a successful European car, ship it to America, and watch the magic happen. On paper, it looked like a perfect transatlantic success story waiting to happen. Except the magic never really arrived. The Contour was cramped, oddly expensive for its class, and unnecessarily complicated to service. Dealers weren't thrilled about selling it, mechanics weren't thrilled about fixing it, and customers weren't thrilled about owning it. So buyers quietly moved on to something roomier and simpler. It wasn't a scandal, it didn't explode, but it proved one important thing: what works perfectly in Europe doesn't always survive in America. At number 6, we have the Ford Explorer, a car that became one of the best-selling SUVs in America and the centre of one of the biggest safety scandals in automotive history. In the late 1990s, reports began piling up: tyre blowouts, rollovers and devastating crashes. The common factor? Firestone tyres fitted to millions of Explorers. What followed was a media storm, congressional hearings and a very public blame game between Ford and Firestone. Billions were spent on recalls, reputations were damaged, and the Ford-Firestone partnership, a relationship that had lasted nearly a century, collapsed overnight. The Explorer itself wasn't supposed to be a villain, but for a moment in time it became the face of one of the most infamous safety crises the auto industry had ever seen. Okay, we're halfway through the list, which means it's time for number 5, the Ford Bronco 2. A vehicle that looked like a tough little off-roader, but behaved more like a physics experiment gone wrong. On paper it sounded great, a compact SUV with a rugged image and the famous Bronco name. In reality, it had a dangerously high centre of gravity and stability that could politely be described as questionable. The result? Rollovers, lawsuits, and a growing pile of very uncomfortable headlines. Critics argued the design was flawed from the start, and courts spent years untangling the consequences. The Bronco 2 wanted to be a fearless off-road machine. Unfortunately, it also had a habit of falling over while trying. At number 4 sits the Ford 500, a car so bland it feels like it was designed during a meeting about office carpeting, the kind of meeting where the most exciting decision of the day was whether the carpet should be light beige or slightly darker beige. Ford wanted a modern, full-size sedan, safe, spacious, sensible, and ready to take on the competition. And technically, it was all of those things. The problem is that driving it felt less like operating a car and more like filling out tax forms. The styling was forgettable, the engine uninspiring, and the name sounded less like a car and more like a budget spreadsheet. In the mid-2000s, when buyers wanted excitement, Ford delivered something that looked like it was already retired. The 500 wasn't a disaster. It was the automotive equivalent of elevator music. Always there, always polite, and impossible to remember 5 seconds later. We've reached the final 3 worst Fords in history. At number 3, we have the Ford Ecosport, a car that desperately tried to look like an SUV, but in reality was more like a hatchback on steroids going through a full-blown identity crisis. Ford marketed it as a rugged urban crossover, ready for the adventures of the modern city explorer. In reality, buyers got cheap plastics, clumsy handling, underwhelming engines, and a rear door that opened sideways, like it belonged on a delivery van from 1993. And the worst part? By the time the Ecosport finally reached Europe and the United States, it already felt outdated, like a car that had missed the last 2 design meetings and hoped nobody would notice. In a market full of sharp, well-designed crossovers, the Ecosport showed up looking confused, underprepared, and slightly embarrassed to be there. It wasn't just disappointing, it felt like Ford had simply stopped trying. At number 2, we have the Ford Focus and C-Max equipped with the infamous power shift transmission, a piece of engineering that managed to turn perfectly decent cars into rolling frustration machines. On paper, it sounded brilliant, a modern, dual-clutch automatic designed to be efficient, quick and smooth. In reality, it was jerky, unreliable, and prone to failures that sent owners to the dealership more often than billionaires visited Epstein's Island. Complaints began to pile up. Lawsuits followed, and Ford had to deal with one of the biggest customer trust crises in its modern history. The tragedy is that the Focus itself was actually a very good car, but the power shift transmission turned it into something else entirely. Proof that sometimes one bad decision is all it takes to ruin everything. And finally, we arrive at number 1 on our not-so-glorious list, the Ford Edsel. Not exactly a moment anyone at Ford would want to celebrate. In the late 1950s, Ford spent a mountain of money creating an entirely new brand, promising the most revolutionary car America had ever seen. Expectations were enormous. The marketing was everywhere. And then the car finally arrived, looking like someone had accidentally designed the front grille during a dentist appointment. Customers were confused. Dealers were nervous, and sales collapsed faster than a cheap lawn chair at a family barbecue. Within just a few years, the entire project was quietly buried, leaving behind one of the most spectacular corporate failures in automotive history. The Edsel wasn't just a bad car, it became something much worse, a legend of failure. So legendary, in fact, that even today, when a product collapses in spectacular fashion, people still say, "Congratulations, you've built an Edsel." And there you have it, 10 cars that prove even giants can trip over their own engineering. From bland sedans that could cure insomnia to SUVs with a rather worrying relationship with gravity, to transmissions that turned the daily commute into a trip to the courtroom. Some of these cars were simply boring. Some were badly designed, and some managed the impressive achievement of being both at the same time. Yet somehow, Ford survived all of it. The scandals, the lawsuits, the marketing disasters, and the occasional mechanical experiment that probably should have stayed on a whiteboard. Because that's the strange thing about the auto industry. You can build a car that explodes, rolls over, or shifts gears like a confused washing machine, and a few years later, build something that becomes a legend. And that really is the story of Ford. Brilliant ideas mixed with some truly spectacular mistakes. And if you enjoyed this ranking, don't go too far, because next week we'll be back with another countdown from another legendary American brand.